We're on Port Over with Mike Finkel, the author of The Art Thief. And The Art Thief is the story of Stéphane Breitweiser, an extraordinary thief that only stole for beauty and never money, yet his destructive passion for art amassed a treasure worth nearly $2 billion. We learn about his origins, his family, his partner in crime, and girlfriend, Anne Catherine, and ultimately his catastrophic downfall. As an art lover, I was shocked that I had never heard of Stefan prior to learning about this book. How did you come upon this story?
Well, first, thank you for having me on the show. Yeah, Stéphane Breitweiser, the reason why you haven't heard of him, and he's probably the greatest art thief maybe who has ever lived, is that he's French. He lives in the Alsace region of northeastern France. He doesn't speak English. We spoke to each other in French. I think if he was American, there would be like 4 movies made about him already. He's also quite media shy, as we may talk about. It took me more than 11 years and counting now to work on this project. And so it was a very slow trust-building exercise between myself and Stéphane Breitweiser, the art thief.
That's amazing. How many times would you say that you met with him over the 11-year period?
So we started by the classical way. I wrote him a letter by hand, a handwritten letter, which is usually the way I like to make contact with people these days when everyone sends texts and emails. A handwritten letter. I think I'm giving away my secrets now, but a handwritten letter, a handwritten letter is really a personal thing. We exchanged handwritten letters written in my mediocre to poor French. And these letters it took like a couple of years of letters. Eventually they got slightly more friendly. I finally received an invitation to have lunch with the art thief. I wasn't permitted to take a recorder or notebook. It was just a hello lunch. And after we had a lunch in which we didn't talk about art thieving, just sort of general introduction, he agreed to sit for a series of interviews. We spent about 40 or 50 hours together, but that also includes museum visits, some really fascinating road trips through Europe, and a lot of cool demonstrations about how one steals a work of art from a museum. And I know everyone's curious about how to do that.
Yes, very much so. I would love to learn more about his methods later on. So Stefan comes across in your book as a very complex person. His love for art is more than just appreciation. It's almost like it's been carved into his essence. Throughout my entire life, I've been dedicated to studying and celebrating art, and some of what he said really resounded with me. I love how he talked about his acquirement of the tobacco box commissioned by Napoleon, and he said to hold it is to travel through time. And he also talks about the hold that art has over him, what it's like to caress a sculpture and feel all the imperfections you wouldn't have noticed otherwise, how energy is really within these pieces, and you don't necessarily see that behind a plexiglass window. Why do you think Stefan did not try to get involved in the arts in a way that would allow him to be close to the pieces rather than thieving?
I mean, you've touched upon a few things. The main reason why I don't think it's a stretch to use the word obsessed. The reason why I became obsessed with this story was not just the number of crimes that Breitweiser committed, which is he stole more than 300 works of art from 200 museums, but the reasons and the way in which he stole without using violence during the daytime. And also I was uncertain about this at the outset. He said that he stole only for the love of art and put all these pieces in his, he was a full-time art thief, so he didn't have a paying job. He put them in the attic of his mother's house where he lived with his girlfriend. Why didn't he, all of us who are admirers of art, and I loved, Ellie, what you just said, I think every time I go to a museum, I dream of what I would like to put over my fireplace mantle.
Oh, completely. All the time.
Yeah, right. And if you think about it, if you truly, everyone has the thing that they love most in the world, whether it's, a mountain or a sunset. But for Stéphane Breitweiser, it was a specific type of Renaissance art in which he just truly was, carried away and captivated by it. And if you think about it, like a museum, I spend a lot of time in museums. It's not the greatest place to really commune with a piece of art. What you really want to do, as Breitweiser was the first to tell me, is like, you want to find a quiet spot. Good luck finding a quiet spot in front of the Mona Lisa. You want
impossible.
You want to relax in a comfortable chair. You don't want to be standing there. You don't want to have a bunch of people with selfie sticks. It's really not conducive to commute. If you really love a piece of art, it's really very difficult. The museum seems like it's great because it gives equal access to almost everyone, but doesn't really allow you to really see a piece of art the way it should be seen. And that same is true for art galleries and even churches. And using his incredibly flawed logic, Stéphane Breitweiser realized that, this aesthete of enormous proportions, needed to bring these pieces home to his attic. He was careful about humidity and light and dust.
Yeah, he even said that he thought that he took care of the pieces better than the museums themselves.
He did say that. I get it. I would, like I said, like we both agreed. I mean, wouldn't it be nice to, I'm a little bit more of a modern art fan than Breitweiser, but boy, would it be nice to have a Klimt or a Picasso or a George O'Keeffe in my room. And I agree. So he placed them in his attic. He convinced himself that this was the right thing to do with these pieces of art, that he appreciated them more than most people. And you can see that I sort of have ambivalent feelings about Breitweiser. Sometimes I admire him, and a lot of times I dislike him, which is a kind of, I think, a healthy attitude to have towards one subject if you're going to try for impartiality as a journalist.
Completely. No, and it's really interesting. When I was reading the book, there were so many things I agreed with, but there were so many things almost equally so that I was horrified by. Going into his youth a little bit. So he lived amongst beautiful and historic artifacts and art in his family home until his parents divorced and the father left with all of the family treasures. This separation absolutely devastated Stefan, and in time partially inspired him to start stealing as well. He and his girlfriend Anne Catherine were visiting a small museum in a farming town when they happened upon a flintlock pistol, similar but far nicer than the ones in his father's collection, and Stefan was overcome with his feelings of loss, knowing that he would never be able to afford one on his own, and went to Anne Catherine, saying that it would be the ultimate FU to his father if he were to take it. And Anne Catherine actually said, take it. This was, in a way, the beginning of hundreds of thefts over several years. But when do you think Stefan's longing turned into obsession and desperation?
Yeah, I mean, I loved that encapsulation. And, as we touched on just a minute ago, I like a main character like a Stéphane Breitweiser, where every reader can have a different opinion at the end between admiration and disgust, and nobody's wrong. And I try in my own writing to lay out the facts as pleasingly as possible, but I really admire, I feel like I honor my readers by letting them decide whether or not he's a good guy or a bad guy. So, when you were talking about his youth, I presented what he said, but I'm not entirely sure if you can go psychology is so complicated. If you can go, well, my father had a beautiful collection of artwork that I adored living with. He leaves, he takes his artwork, that triggers a stealing raid. I'm sure we can find 100 examples of people that didn't do such a thing. I mean, even speaking with his father and the depositions that his father gave to the police, it was clear that Stéphane Breitweiser, the art thief, had this attraction to inanimate objects all his life. His father collected antique weapons, ivories, watches, and even paintings. There was his last name is Breitweiser, or Breitweiser as they call it there, and he had a member of his family that was also a painter. And so he was surrounded by these things. I think he felt comforted by it. He's an unusual person in that he's a little bit of a loner, except for his girlfriend. And I feel like just like I love to read, and I remember growing up thinking that, I wasn't the most outgoing person, and I felt like books, and I'm looking at the books behind you right now. I thought that books were sort of my inanimate objects, my friends, my world that had opened up. So I sort of understood that you are correct. He fell in love with a woman named Anne Catherine Kleinklaus, and she had no criminal history at all. And somehow the melange between the two of them really just, it sparked a thieving spree that is just not only unequaled in the annals of art crime, but just like there's not even like a second place. They stole, just to jump in, they stole, I think, an average of one piece every 12 days for more than 7 years in the heat of that. And so I think there was the roots of obsession from when he was a kid. That first crime that you mentioned, he stole something that he ended up not even loving. Like his taste sort of matured. I think he was 23 years old or something like that when he stole his first piece. And so none of our tastes are 100% matured then, but he stole this pistol, and then I think he panicked and thought he was about to get arrested, and no police actually came. nobody caught him. And I think the success of his first crime begot a few more, and the latent obsession for inanimate objects that appealed to his sense of aesthetics sort of just came to the forefront and literally took over his life and that of his, to a lesser extent, that of his girlfriend who served as lookout.
Another part of the book that I really appreciated is how much he went into detail with his methods for stealing, which were pretty logical and simplistic. Mostly during the daytime and make sure no one is around. Those were kind of the major two rules. But the most ingenious method to me was when he was using museum cards. Lots of exhibitions have assortments of objects on display, and some items would be removed for restoration, and a little card would be left behind detailing their removal. And Stefan would rearrange the displays after taking what he wanted and use the cards to distract from their absence, which I thought was just so brilliant. It's so simple and effective and graceful. Were there any methods that you found particularly innovative?
So, as I mentioned, Stéphane Breitweiser stole every single piece during opening hours in a museum, while tourists and even sometimes guards were in the room. I mean, he's like journalistic catnip. I mean, the way Breitweiser, he has a great memory, in which, by the way, I tried to verify everything through police reports or talking to the museums themselves. And if I was only 99% sure of something, I would cut that out. I want to emphasize that this is a true story, not a fictionalized, not slightly fictionalized, not 1% fictionalized, but true, because it's so unbelievable that any unnecessary exaggerations would almost make it worse. Let's see. He carried into a museum almost no thieving tools except for a Swiss Army knife. And he had a nice long jacket that was just tailored or purchased just a little bit too roomy. And I just loved the number of things one person can do with a single Swiss Army knife, which involved, like, you look at a display case, they have these big locks on it, but they also have a sliding door. All you have to do is take the screwdriver attachment out and just using it as like a little bit of a lever, just slightly unhinge the sliding door of a display case, and it hangs like a mailbox flap, and you can stick your hand in. Even like the most alarmed and tightly sealed display cases are connected by silicone glue. You can cut those things and you can separate panels. I think, as you mentioned, I think the simplicity of his crimes, but also just the sheer chutzpah, the like the sang-froid, as they would say in French, the cold-bloodedness. Like, I couldn't steal a pack of gum without like breaking out into flop sweat. And like, I don't have the mental fortitude or whatever. Maybe I'm just unfortunately too honest or afraid of being caught. You mentioned basically my favorite thing too, which is basically he came across a display case that was half empty and he thought, oh my gosh, an art thief had been here before him. And in turn, it says there's just a little folded index card in the display case that says objects removed for study, which if you spend a lot of time in historical museums, there's often a little card, like literally a note card. And he actually breaks into that case just to steal the note card. He didn't like any of the things in it and ends up stealing a bunch from another case and just placing an index card in the case from which he stole. And as he told me, he's like, we talked a lot about historical thieving where people use like, Uzis and machine guns. And, you think about the movies coming in through a skylight and, infrared things and all that Tom Cruise sort of jazz. And he said to me, Mike, the most effective tool I've ever used to steal art was a bent index card. And I'm a sucker for a great story. And I was sort of fascinated by his simple and yet insanely daring methods.
So simple and so daring, but just so smart. So smart. Like, not that I'm an aspiring thief whatsoever, but that would never come across to me, to just use that simple little folded piece of paper to, get away with stealing the most amazing works.
I was going to say he had a general ethos, which is what he said to me was something that an art thief would never do is something that he thought, oh, well, that's exactly what I should do. For example, he stole several times on a guided tour. Now, you think about a guided tour where a docent or a a museum employee knows your face, you're right there. And he would often take something when they were visiting a room, put it in his backpack or at the small of his back, and continue with the tour and engage the tour guide, because this would be maybe the last person you would suspect.
Right.
Often a theft is noticed fairly quickly in a museum and alarms are sounded. And he thought, you know what an art thief would never do with a piece of stolen art on them? Well, how about eat at the museum cafe? And he did that with his girlfriend with multiple stolen pieces on him, basically while the police are called. And where's the last place the police are going to go? Right to the museum cafe? No, they're going to go look for these thieves hiding or running. And so just subverting these expectations was, and I feel like I'm speaking of him with undue admiration, but I have to admit, if everybody acted like him, all of society would collapse. There are these sort of rules, but I couldn't help, feel a little bit. I'm not hesitant to use, but maybe a little jealous of his ability to get away with this. Like I said, I wouldn't be able to do a single one of his crimes without I would be arrested immediately. But it was fascinating to sit in a tiny hotel room in Europe and do an interview. While he would just explain to me his methods, and even one time stole my own laptop out of my tiny hotel room right under my nose. And I didn't notice it. And it was when I was questioning him about how he could steal in front of other people. And he was like, look around. And I was like, I don't see anything. And he lifts up his shirt and there's my laptop stuck in in this waistband of his pants. I had just lowered my eyes for a couple of seconds to take a note. And he obviously stole it, stuck it there, and returned to the calmest sitting position. And I never saw it. I think that action alone in my hotel room sort of brought to focus his thieving ability. And then, of course, as you said at the outset, there's this sort of aesthetic, there's this whole another level of conversation where we just spoke about art as if he was just an art professor, not a thief.
That's absolutely incredible. I don't know what I would have done in that situation, because he just seems like a master at subverting. Yeah, just incredibly impressive. And I would also like to talk a little bit about another thief in a way that you wrote about. You wrote the bestseller, The Stranger in the Woods, which was about Christopher Knight, the last true hermit. He lived undiscovered in the Maine woods for 27 years. Even through the harshest Maine winters, he would never light a fire since it could risk his whereabouts. To survive, he'd break into surrounding homes and steal food, gear, tech, and reading materials to supply his isolation. There's something that I understand in both of them. With Knight, I can empathize with his need to escape and live in solitude, to have the quiet and the intense relationship between human and nature. But that's also mostly because I live in New York City. And with Stefan, there are moments that I see a work of art that is so moving that I can't get it out of my head, and I want to devour it and own it in any way possible. There are unique similarities between the two. They were both thieves, one stealing for necessity and the other for passion, but also in a way necessity. Do you also feel that there's a connection?
So, Allie, as a journalist, I feel like sort of like Stéphane Breitweiser's obsessions, and even the hermit that you mentioned, Chris Knight's sort of obsessive need to be by himself. I guess I have to follow what really sparks fascination, obsession in myself. Now, heroes of the world, like the freedom fighters and the soldiers and the firefighters and all these, and the frontline nurses and doctors, I admire these heroes, but I actually don't. They're almost like distant stars. I couldn't imagine. I'm a flawed human being. I almost couldn't imagine this. And so I'm really attracted to the scallywags and the ruffians and the sort of slightly immoral people. And so, so I find that the story of Christopher Knight, the person who lived in the woods of Maine by himself and stole from people's houses, and the story of Stéphane Breitweiser, the art thief who stole from museums, I believe that they're similar in that, as I mentioned before, as a reader, you could have almost any opinion about this person, from complete understanding and admiration to utter disgust. And none of those reactions are wrong. And in fact, I don't disagree with any of them, because as a person who has to spend a lot of time sort of cogitating about these stories and writing them down, I also sort of in my own writing room range from disappointment and sometimes real disgust to the jealousy and fascination. And I sort of look for those. I like a main character that is hard to pin down. And I feel like there's a good book, and I'm not saying that mine are good. That's for you to decide. A good book, I think, is not like a professor at a lectern, but really more of a dance, like between the reader and the writer. And like, I like to involve, I always imagine the reader sort of like, oh, I like him now. Oh, I don't like him now. And sort of, it's a conversation, even though it might seem kind of one-ended, but I think a good book, or when I'm enjoying a book, fiction or nonfiction, I feel like I'm having a little bit of a conversation with the author, and I strive to achieve that. Don't know if I succeed, but I strive.
Oh, you definitely succeed.
Very kind of you to say.
You really do. I really enjoyed reading The Stranger in the Woods as well. You write really beautifully about these outsiders, scallywags, and their passions, and it really comes through. And I mean, maybe that's just me and the way that I take it, the way that I'm reading it, kind of, I don't know, affiliating myself with an outsider as well. But it's you provide all the details, which is absolutely wonderful, because you do allow the reader to make their own choice in their relationship with the characters. It's really good.
I also sometimes think the world of readers. I grew up as a reader. I mean, I always wanted to be a writer as well, but really I think of myself as a reader. And sometimes the books I write are just the ones I can't find that are already on the shelf. So I just have to add one to the collection. But readers we're kind of a odd tribe ourselves, where whether or not we're the most outgoing person or not, we all readers like to spend time by themselves with an object in their hands and tumble into the world of a book. And so I think that the strange and wonderful tribe of readers sort of gets the, we can kind of groove with other people who have sort of oddball passions. And I think both Breitweiser and the Hermit really like to spend time by themselves. The Hermit loved to read, as did Breitweiser. We talked about books almost as much as we talked about art. He was an autodidact. He also had a huge collection of books. In fact, he stole a book right while I was with him. And as one lawyer said, well, if you were there and you witnessed him stealing a book, you could be an accomplice. And so please don't arrest me, French authorities.
Don't arrest me. To do all the research for The Art Thief, you met with investigators, psychologists, government officials, museum workers, and even Stefan's personal framer. Of everyone besides Stefan himself, who was able to give you the most insight?
Breitweiser really was somewhat of a loner. He had a tiny little inner circle. He was in love with his girlfriend and accomplice, Anne Catherine Kleinklas. He had a very, who doesn't have somewhat of an odd relationship with their mother, but he had a very tight relationship with his mother, sometimes for good, sometimes for ill, and two grandparents, and that was it. Mother, grandparents, girlfriend, that was his inner circle. One other person was admitted to this inner circle, which was the person that framed all of his stolen works, this artisan framer named Christian Meischler, who I had kind of one of the most loop-de-loop interviews I've ever had in my entire life. It was like meeting another Breitweiser, someone obsessed with the aesthetics and art, but one who, like me and like you, Allie, was afraid to steal. But I think Meischler, the framer who framed all of the Breitweisers, he stole 69, 68 Renaissance paintings, which is insane. They're incredibly valuable. I mean, they're unique. Every painting's unique. You really can't even put a price on a museum work, and framed most of them. Framers are not in the business of asking how you acquired something. And I believe actually Meischler, the framer, did not know that these works were stolen, but certainly had an odd friendship with the thief. But this framer spoke about works of art and what it was like to have an intense discussion with Breitweiser. Breitweiser actually volunteered to work in his frame shop, learning how to frame paintings, but really, between me and you and the pages of the book, really learning how to take frames apart so he could do so in a museum very quickly. Even at, giving away just a little bit, even at Breitweiser's trials, the framer Meischler couldn't bring himself to say anything bad about Breitweiser the thief, because he's like, I've never met such a young person that could speak with, art with such passion, had nothing to do with price tags. Breitweiser never, during his stealing days, sold a work. So even though he stole, like you mentioned, an estimated as much as $2 billion worth of art, he was broke. He didn't sell any of these things. He considered himself the richest person perhaps in the world, but he didn't have any money. And I think there was something about this sort of old school, like I think whenever you read about a work of art in a newspaper or magazine, what's the next thing after they mention the title? They mention how much it's worth. I get it. I'm kind of curious too. That's $100 million painting, that's cool. But really everything seems to be reduced to its price tag rather than, oh my God, that's the most wonderful color of blue. That seems to be not as important a thing as the price tag. But Breitweiser himself was really, truly, he was a thief of all thieves, obsessed with the aesthetic details. And I think this framer and him, I can only imagine the crazy discussions they had in the frame, this tiny little, like completely disorganized frame shop like this. You walk into this shop and you're just surrounded with bits of, it feels like you've walked into the middle of a painting in progress. I really loved speaking with Meisler. And it was one of those I knocked on the door. I thought I might get 30 seconds. And like 4 hours later and a bottle of wine later, we're still talking about what it was like to encounter Breitweiser. And he, like me, was sort of not sure how to deal with it all and how to handle all the disparate parts of Breitweiser's personality, the absolute thief who's like basically a bane on society, a cancer on the common, what binds us all together, the ability to go to museums, and yet at the other hand, like this aesthete of impressive proportions. And I kind of like that. That's sort of, I was glad to meet also a person who felt like me, like all over the place about the same person at the same time, which, like I said, I try to capture that those are the subjects that attract me for a book.
Yeah, you captured it beautifully. I loved his storyline within the book, and I loved reading your conversations with him. You were saying that Stefan despised other art thieves. He despised their tactics that left priceless works destroyed and their only motivation being money. And I'm going to try and avoid spoilers right now because the ending of this book is absolutely insane. It had me in a vice, and I was stunned at how it all fell apart. But in the end, do you think that Stefan still considered himself different than other thieves?
Breitweiser, as I mentioned, was a big reader, and a lot of what he read was art history, art theory, but also he was fascinated by other people that stole art. And, when you think of an art thief, or I think of an art thief, there's probably somehow I'm always picturing like maybe the Thomas Crown Affair, someone in like a tuxedo, or like a James Bond movie where there's always like this connoisseur and this sort of gentleman thief or gentle person thief. In reality, 99.99, almost every art thief in history really was doing it for money, had no interest in art. In fact, as we mentioned before, maybe even hated. How could you stick a knife in a Rembrandt? What kind of a criminal would do that? And so Breitweiser hated to be called an art thief, which is sort of funny because he is the art thief. But he hated that because of the implications that he was breaking works and destroying them. And as you mentioned before, no matter where you think the ending is going, you probably will not guess what happens, which is one of the things I love.
You won't. Like you can't even make this up.
If I made it up, you would throw the book across the room and saying this stuff isn't believable.
This is impossible.
I know it's one of the reasons why I really became obsessed with the story is that it is, it's a cliche, but I really look for it. This truth is way stranger than fiction. There is no way if I was writing fiction, I would attempt to have an ending as operatic, perhaps, as Breitweiser's. But I think, yes, Allie, right to the very end. So Breitweiser has a big ego, thankfully, because he spoke to me at such great length, admitting to crimes that even the police didn't know. The statute of limitations on most of them have run out, telling me secrets and things that no investigation ever uncovered. I love when someone starts galloping away and telling stories. And so, yeah, he has a big ego. He's proud of what he did. And so yes, to this very day, Breitweiser, who's only like 52, 53 years old right now, he did all of his stealing in his 30s, 20s, 30s, and early 40s. He feels that he is a different breed of thief, more in line with the fictitious thieves of pop
sophisticated
culture. Yeah. And he sort of was,
he actually was, though.
He's not wrong. I know for a fact he would rather have gone to jail than sliced a Rembrandt. He would have rather sliced himself than sliced a Rembrandt, honestly.
It's true. The art always came first.
I walked through a few museums with the world's greatest art thief. He would put on like a light disguise. It was like your favorite professor of all time sort of whispering in your ear and then like turning like the dark side. Like first you talk about the art and then he would like take my hand and make me like touch with the lightest touch, like a painting in a museum,
so
which
cool.
But if you don't feel the ridges of one of the things we love about them is that they're done by humans. They're not made by machines. And each brushstroke there is a third dimension to a painting. It's not a two-dimensional thing, it's three-dimensional, but you really don't know till you touch it. And then he would, then the tour would continue to like how it was attached to the wall and then where the cameras were and how he would avoid the security guards and where he had parked the car, etc. He's changed the way I walk through museums, by the way.
Yeah. So every time you visit another museum, like it's kind of going in your head.
Yeah, so I tried to bring some of that out in the book, and I hope that if you read it, the readers too will not look at artwork or museums the same way. And I also love the way Breitweiser didn't like the way professors and tour guides spoke about art. Like, you think about Venus or a Renaissance painting, and you guys can decide whether you're in this category or not. But I get into this like pseudo weird, sophisticated mode in a museum where I'm like, oh, what a fine form there, a nice use of color.
The juxtaposition is wonderful.
Yeah, exactly. And look at the symbolism. Well, Breitweiser's like, Mike, screw the big tomes, that you got in your art history class. How do you feel? How do you feel?
Why do you connect to this piece?
Yeah, right. And it's like all these things that you probably did when you were like 9 years old. It turns out to Breitweiser, the art thief, that's exactly how you should look at a painting, not with art history and big vocabulary eyes, but with most, seems a little cliche, but almost like childish eyes. Like, how do you feel?
Yeah.
Like we've sort of lost this ability to that's part of the painting. That's why, that's why Renaissance paintings are like that. They are tittillating, and why even deny that? And once you not only deny it, fully accept it, you run with how you feel.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and also, there are some that are definitely erotic, but then there are others that are incredibly disturbing. And it's just like, art elicits an emotion. It's a give and take. And I do feel that a lot of museums lose that because constantly surrounded by people, you have art history being thrown in your face quite a bit. I'm excited to go and look at other museums now after reading this book and taking a little bit of Breitweiser's methodology with me.
I mean, I would just only suggest maybe leaving them in the museum.
Yeah. No, I won't take them.
I mean, if you do, I got some advice for you. Maybe just a Swiss Army knife, a large jacket. Anyway.
Yeah. Large jacket, bag,
Ellie, I was
perhaps.
just thinking, during this conversation, I was just thinking, I think one of the reasons why maybe I'm just selfish. I can only, it takes me several years to produce a book. And I think the reason why I can live with a story so long is that, I think I got something out of the deal from hanging out with Breitweiser and listening to his sometimes crazy, sometimes completely intelligent analyses. It sort of changed the way you never think about an art thief eating lunch at the museum cafe, but you also don't like the way he spoke about art was refreshingly approachable. Is what I'm trying to say. Sometimes I feel like people feel like they are excluded from museums because they don't have the right vocabulary. And he would be so disappointed if anybody out there felt like, you know what, how you feel in front of a piece of art is correct. That's exactly right. Because that's what it's there for. As you just said, Allie, it's not there to make you, just decode hidden symbols, which exist, but that's a secondary thing. It's really there. And if you don't like it, you're right. You know what? You're right.
And that is fine.
Yeah, it's totally fine.
If you hate a painting, that is also fine.
It's totally fine. I don't know. People get nervous that, just because it's the Museum of Modern Art, if you don't like it, you're correct.
Yeah,
and there's
totally fine.
Yeah, he hated modern art, Breitweiser, and I like it, but I totally respect it. Like how you feel is, and so there's just sort of like, I don't know. So maybe like 90% of this book is things you shouldn't do, but maybe 10% should change how
Makes sense.
Like even how you look at anything that attracts you, a lover, a sunset, a rainbow, and a Renaissance painting.
Exactly. I do want to say before we end that I was reading, I read the last few chapters on the subway, and I want to reiterate to the listeners and soon to be readers how insane this ending is. I was just like verbally groaning. I think I yelled like, no, please no, a few times. How is this even possible? And it is just one of the most fascinating stories I have ever read. And you did a wonderful job of presenting this. And I can't wait for readers to get their hands on it because this is just a one-of-a-kind story.
Well, I can only say thank you for such kind words. I'm like, I'm so pleased that you enjoyed hearing about Breitweiser, because I really kind of enjoyed writing about him.
Yeah, and you get that in the book too. It's exciting.
Yeah, exciting. I read a lot of very serious things, and of course, the news every day further reduces my hairline. And so this is supposed to be just, I mean, it's completely true, but it's also supposed to be, I don't know. I think I grew up reading books that were fun to read and not assignments in school, not dense tomes, and I'm not opposed to either of those things, but sometimes you just want to read something that's supposed to be fascinating and fun. And so thank you so much for what you just said about it. That's really, really means so much to me.
Oh, great. Yeah, but thank you for writing this. This has been wonderful. And thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.